welcome to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about rolls. If you've already watched my video on playing 4 or more notes, which at this stage you may have watched that and you may be working on that in your pieces, then you know that there are situations where we absolutely have to do rolls, and you're already working on them. Today is going to be talking a little bit more about situations where you don't have to do a roll, but you may want to do a roll. Now, for those of you who don't know what a roll is, it's simply a fast arpeggio that breaks a chord. So, for example, if I have a 5-note chord and I've only got 4 fingers that I use to pluck, the pinky rests, then I need to break the chord in some way. I need to play the notes separately. So an unbroken chord would be everything played at the same time. And a broken chord or a rolled chord would be like this. And if I do a 5-note version, and if I do a 6-note. Now, some of that I go over in more detail in that episode on 4 or more voices. So if you haven't seen that, go check that one out. There are some tips and tricks there for getting that smoother, and we'll throw in a few more today. Now, the question arises, we know that they had to roll certain chords. We know that they could strum chords. If you've seen that video, again, you'll hear me discuss the fact that they would sometimes use their thumb all the way through. The question is, what about less notes? Would you roll a chord with fewer than 5 notes when you don't have to? So, for example, if I had a chord with 4 notes, and in this case, I'm just making a little dissonance here. Can I roll it, or do I have to play it? And it's an interesting question because I think people are very passionate. I've seen discussions online. Some people are like everything should be played together. Other people accept the idea that they almost certainly rolled even when they didn't have to. I'll give you my personal sort of opinion on it, but I also want to talk about like what are some good times to roll if you're going to do it. So I would say if you're one of those people who's in the camp that's just like, I don't think they rolled unless they absolutely have to, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I think it's slightly unrealistic. I think when you look at how often they had to roll, it had to be part of their vocabulary. And when you get into the 17th century, they were doing all sorts of things. There's descriptions, particularly Burl and Mace, where rolling is just a big part of the sound world that they were living in. And it's hard for me to imagine that they went the whole 16th century just playing everything like this, and then suddenly the 17th century hits and they're rolling, especially when we have chords that have to be rolled, especially when we see techniques like the Dalza stroke that I talked about in the previous video, where the thumb goes through all of them. So I think I would say if you're one of those people that does not like to hear rolls unless they're absolutely necessary, that's fine. You can make that part of your sort of artistic identity. I'm sure that like rubato, vibrato, like certain color changes and things like that, every lute player in the 16th century had their taste and their amount. We know that they had different ideas about ornamentation. Some people put a lot of ornamentation and some people put a little. So I think rolling is one of those things that you have to kind of approach with taste. Now, where can we put, assuming that we're going to do rolls beyond 5 and 6 note chords, where are some good places to do rolls? And I'd say it depends on the type of roll. So for example, you can do an energizing roll, or you can do a de-energizing roll. And it's not rocket science. An energizing roll is a fast one. And a de-energizing roll. And one of the other things you'll notice about those two rolls is one of them technically has a sort of crescendo to the top. Like that. And the other one decrescendos. Now, I think the second one, the one that decrescendos and slows down as it goes up, is absolutely wonderful for final chords of phrases or the final chord of a piece. So if I get to the end of a piece, and you'll actually notice I used two forms of rolls there. I used the energetic one, and that de-energizing roll almost becomes an arpeggio. And I talked about this a little bit in the previous episode, but I call the measured breaking of a chord. So for example, if I were to take a chord and I were to go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and that, I would call an arpeggio. And then anything that is sort of free in timing, that doesn't actually take up real time, I would call a roll. So this would be like 1 and 2 and versus 1 and 2 and 3 and I know that when we do these de-energizing rolls, it gets a little murky, right? Because you're slowing down. You could totally think of this as 1 and 2 and so there's a murkiness there. Well, welcome to art, right? This isn't math. This isn't 1 + 1 = 2. There's going to be some murkiness in there between arpeggio and roll, and that line is going to be blurred in certain situations. Now, so places you can roll that I think are nice. Now, keep in mind, a lot of this is taste. I mean, the honest truth is that you can put a recording of Nigel North or Paul O'Dette or Hopkinson Smith or whoever, and you can listen to them, and they will put their rolls in different places. They'll use energizing rolls, and one of them will use an energizing roll in a place, another might do no roll at all, or they might change the phrase. So I don't want anybody to watch this, hear what I have to say, and go, oh, that is the way. This definitely falls into what I would consider taste, and you can totally do something different than me, and I might disagree with it, but I'd have to, to some degree, respect it and say, oh, okay, I understand where you're coming from. It's not my preference, but that is certainly something you can do. We don't have enough information. We don't have recordings of them in the 16th century. This sort of detail is not covered. People will cherry pick quotes from sources. They'll find a quote that says a little something here or something like that. But all you're doing, though, is getting that author's opinion on something. And we'll talk a little bit more about interpreting sources in a future episode, and sort of being careful about taking one person's opinion from the 16th century and applying it to everybody's playing. We have to be very careful about that. So for me personally, I like to use energizing chords. I like to use the energizing roll maybe at the beginning of a phrase. If I'm doing something like, we've got the opening of maybe some sort of Galliard or Saltarello, something like that just gives a nice. And then, obviously, I like to use the de-energizing ones at the very end of a phrase if I'm doing something like. That last one being the de-energizing one. That's a clue to where else I also like to use the energizing rolls. So the other place that I like to use energizing rolls are on dissonances that resolve in cadences. So for example, the 4/3 suspension. Now, if you don't know what a 4/3 suspension is, I highly recommend, I'm going to put the link in the description. Check out the Artusi website. A former classmate, technically, and colleague of mine helped to design this website. It's a free website that basically gets you through 3 or 4 semesters of undergraduate music theory. But to put it briefly, a 4/3 suspension is just when you have a consonant. So I'll give you an example. So we've got G at the top of this, E, C, G. So this is a C major chord in first inversion. This is a consonant chord. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep that G, and we're basically going to play a D chord. But instead of F sharp, we're going to play that G on top and then resolve it down to F sharp. So we have this dissonance, which we want to emphasize and we want to bring out. And then the whole thing. I think my teacher Paul Odette used to say dissonance, resolution, dissolve. So dissonance, resolution, dissolve. And you could have other 7/6 suspensions. You can have 6/5, which is kind of a milder version, which is really nice. So finding and learning a little bit more about your music theory and identifying these spots, because what we want to do in Renaissance music is we want to emphasize those dissonances. We don't want to shy away from it. I think it would be much less interesting to go, that doesn't carry as much weight as, we want to bring out that gesture. And you can look for other dissonances in your music. It doesn't necessarily have to be one that's being used at a cadence. You may have a chord with a 7 in it, like that, A minor 7, and you can use that roll to bring that out. And then if we're even talking about something like 2 notes, for example, if you're doing some kind of, that's really interesting, right? Because I could have gone, so I'm starting with F and A, I'm going, and I could have just played them together. Or, let me do that again. You can really bring that out. I don't know which I like in that moment, but it's something you can play with even when you have just 2 notes. And there's a nice example. So you could do that, which is very nice. That one I happen to just pick something where I'm like, I don't know, maybe I kind of like that, simultaneously playing those 2 notes. So you have to play around with it and figure out, well, do I like it with the roll, or do I think it's more impactful without it? And I think ironically in that spot, I think I actually kind of like just playing it simultaneously. But in a situation like this, and that's a 6/5. Now I could do something like 7/6. There we go. Versus playing them together, which I think doesn't have quite as much punch. So using a roll to bring out a dissonance, and then using sort of straight playing, playing the notes simultaneously to play the resolution is really nice. You do not have to always do that, though. And in fact, I would say I used to do it too much. And I think it can take the sort of pulse out of a piece, especially a faster piece. So if you have like a galliard where you're going pretty fast or something like that, it can really, rolling every chord can kind of take the energy out of it. So you may want to do something where you just play that straight. So don't feel like you always have to roll when you see a dissonance, but it can be used. And we do want to be careful about sort of using rolls too often, and we don't want all our rolls to be the same speed. So for example, if you're always just going, and then you go, and they're all just kind of that speed, you may want to play around, or getting some more energetic. And I think spacing them out, making them something special, is a really wonderful thing. But don't worry too much. I've heard really, really phenomenal musicians, people I respect immensely, maybe overdo it with rolls. And then also maybe their roll speeds are the same and it gets a little tiring. I mean, everybody, it's just taste. It's just working toward improving, and I don't want people to be afraid to use rolls either. So use them sparingly, I think, and use them for special moments, because I think they can be a really wonderful thing. Now, in terms of actually doing them, if some of you are still struggling from the 4+, it can be helpful to sort of start practicing. I think it's easiest to start learning the roll with just the fingers, because this seems to be a more of a natural move. The difficulty comes when we try to combine the thumb with the fingers. So what you may want to do is just pick some little chords and practice these sort of things. You know, just going through and then the other thing you can practice is getting the thumb and the index smooth. Because usually what happens is we get this sort of break, thumb, fingers, and what we want is this smooth. I describe it, you know, it's funny, I said this in the other video, it's either like petting a cat or a dog, or sort of opening a jar. It's a single movement. You know, if you're thumb out, I think maybe the opening the jar is the better. I kind of get this whenever I play in thumb out position. Or if I'm in thumb under, it's a little more like petting a pet, cat or a dog. But first getting used to the three fingers, then working on thumb and index, and making sure it's not, but almost a single gesture. 1, 2, 3, 4, ba-dum, ba-dum. And I do think that vocalizing helps. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, 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 ba-da-da-da-dum. Just making it a single motion, which can be really tricky. And I mentioned this in the other video. I think my experience with it isn't that you start super slow and then make your way gradually up to it. What happens is you work out the motion, and once you've got it, it just sort of clicks. And kind of work on that. You can practice it on your hand, you can practice it on a table or something like that. But I don't think it's the sort of thing where if you practice it and you just speed it up, that doesn't actually produce the result, because what you're going for is this motion of like a single gesture. All the fingers are just kind of flowing after the other. So instead, I would again find, get the fingers to do it through the thumb and index, then try 3 PIM, and then 4, and then practice thumb playing multiple like we talked about in the previous video on 4 or more voices. That sort of thing. Anything else to say? I think not a whole lot, other than, you know, work on varying your speed. The ring finger sometimes can be a little bit weak, so just make sure, because that's often playing the highest note, we want to make sure we really pop out. So for example, if I'm doing something like this is from the canzone. We want to make sure that note comes out clearly and it's not too low or too light. So keep in mind that this is, we're definitely getting into the realm of taste here, but I think, again, this is a tool. It's a thing that we know they used in some circumstances. The question becomes, well, do they take that outside of those circumstances? I think, yeah, very, very likely. It would blow my mind if they didn't roll or break some chords beyond the 5-note chords. We know they did in the 17th century. We know there are things like séparé in French music. It starts to get notated, so it would really surprise me if they didn't, or at least that some players didn't. And as long as there were some players who were doing it, I think we can feel free to do it. So experiment with some rolls, play around with them, see if there might be some appropriate places in your music. Again, if you're a little bit behind in the music theory and you don't know what a dissonance is, or you don't know what a 4/3 suspension is, or a 7/6 or a 9/8 suspension, go check out the R2Z link that I'm going to put in the description, and you may start putting in 5 to 10 minutes a day on those exercises. It's totally free. You can sign up as long as you're not getting college credit, and it'll just gently take you through a couple semesters of undergraduate music theory. So I'm sure there'll be some comments and some questions and thoughts on this. Please feel free to put those below. If you're enjoying the channel so far, the best way you can support it is to subscribe. I'll also put my Patreon link in the description if you'd like to support in that way. It's always appreciated. Happy luting, happy practicing, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.